Before the I Ching became known as a philosophy book, the Zhouyi was first a divination text. This slide is called Before the Book.
Here, the word book refers to Zhouyi, which later became the transmitted classic. The Zhouyi gradually took shape during the Western Zhou period, around 3,000 years ago. But this does not mean that Chinese ideas about change, images, numbers, time, and divination are only 3,000 years old. When we look further back, archaeological evidence takes us to the Neolithic period, around 8,500 years ago, and in some cases even earlier. By that time, we already find symbols, numerical patterns, ritual objects, and cultural traces left by long-term observation of nature and cyclical change. These archaeological materials reveal traditions of symbols, ritual, and observation of the heavens that existed long before the transmitted Book of Changes. They show that later, traditions, image number thinking, and divinatory practices developed upon much older layers of cultural knowledge. One important source of early Chinese civilization and later learning was the observation of the heavens. Ancient people observed the sun, the moon, the stars, day and night, the four seasons, and recurring patterns in nature. Through these observations, they developed calendars, organized agriculture, determined the timing of rituals, and tried to understand changes in the state and in human affairs. For this reason, in ancient China, astronomy, calendrics, agriculture, ritual, politics, and divination were not completely separate fields. Later concepts such as yin and yang, time, direction, image, number, and the relationship between heaven and humanity were also connected with this long tradition of observing the movements of heaven and earth. Next, we need to distinguish two important paths in early Chinese divination. The first is Bu, or crack-based divination. This means making judgments through cracks produced on turtle shells or animal bones. Oracle bone divination during the Shang dynasty is one of the clearest surviving early Chinese divinatory traditions. The royal court used turtle shells and ox shoulder blades to ask about sacrifices, warfare, weather, harvest, illness, hunting, and other royal affairs. The diviner first drilled or carved hollows into the shell or bone and then applied heat to produce cracks. The cracks were interpreted to determine good or bad fortune. The question, the judgment, and sometimes even the later result were then inscribed on the shell or bone. Oracle bone inscriptions are also important because they preserve one of the earliest mature forms of Chinese writing known today. Many early Chinese characters developed from visual images of people, animals, objects, and natural phenomena. In the surviving oracle bone records, writing was closely connected with divination, ritual, and communication with ancestors and divine powers. This means that from a very early stage, images, writing, and divination were closely connected. A written sign could preserve an image, and that image could carry meaning. Here, we can already see an important foundation of the image-based thinking that later became central to the tradition. The second path is Shu, or stalk-based and hexagram-based divination. This tradition used yarrow stalks, numbers, yin and yang lines, and hexagrams to form a structure for judgment. The traditions of Lianshan, Guicang, and the Book of Changes, together known as the 3 belong more closely to the world of Shu. They are connected with the 8 trigrams, the 64 hexagrams, numbers, and patterns of change. Put simply, Bu reads cracks. Shi forms hexagrams. Zhouyi, the rites of Zhou, records, the grand diviner was in charge of the methods of the 3 The first was Lianshan. The second was Guicang. The third was the Zhouyi. The text also states that each tradition began with 8 basic trigrams and expanded through change into 64 hexagrams. This tells us that in later institutional memory, the ancient traditions of were not limited to the Zhouyi alone. Traditionally, Lianshan is associated with the Xia dynasty around 4,000 years ago. Guicang is associated with the Shang dynasty more than 3,000 years ago. And the Zhouyi is associated with the Western Zhou around 3,000 years ago. However, Lianshan and Guicang were not transmitted as complete texts in the same way as the Zhouyi. What survives today consists mainly of fragmentary records, later quotations, and some excavated materials. So the most important point of this slide is the Zhouyi became the transmitted classic, but it was not the whole history of Chinese divination.
This slide echoes an important idea from Lesson 1.
But here, our focus is more specific. We need to distinguish the core text of Zhouyi from I Ching, the 10 Wings. Many modern readers describe the I Ching as a book of philosophy, wisdom, or guidance for life.
This is not entirely wrong, but we need to separate different historical layers.
If we are talking about the core text of Zhouyi, the 64 hexagrams, their names, judgments, and line texts, then its direct literary form is first and foremost a divinatory text. The Zhouyi text is extremely concise.
Its judgments and line texts are highly compressed. They contain many concrete scenes involving warfare, hunting, marriage, crossing great rivers, ritual, illness, migration, objects, and animals. They also preserve judgment terms such as auspicious, ominous, regret, shame, and no errors. These materials may have developed from divinatory experience accumulated over long periods of time. In repeated consultations, ancient diviners could record which hexagram appeared, which line changed, what question was asked, and what later happened. As cases accumulated, the images, roles, situations, actions, and outcomes associated with the same hexagram or the same line position may gradually have been organized and classified. These divinatory cases and judgment experiences were then compressed and textualized within the structure of the 64 hexagrams and 384 lines. This is one possible way to understand how the judgments and line texts took shape. Rather than imagining that King Wen of Zhou created an abstract book of philosophy out of nothing, it is more reasonable to understand the Zhouyi text as developing from earlier divinatory traditions, accumulated cases, observed outcomes, and long-term practices of image-taking. This may also explain why some judgments and line texts do not read like continuous philosophical essays. A single line position may preserve images, roles, and judgments drawn from different divinatory situations. After these materials were highly compressed into one line text, the result could contain sudden changes of scene. Later, Yi Zhuan, the 10 Wings, together with subsequent commentarial traditions, further systematized ideas such as yin and yang, timing and position, change, and the relationship between heaven and humanity. They also developed more complete philosophical, ethical, and interpretive frameworks. The core Zhouyi text preserved earlier traditions of observing heaven and earth, image number thinking, and practical judgment through the direct form of a divinatory text. The 10 Wings and later commentarial traditions further develop its philosophical, ethical, and interpretive dimensions. But divination itself was not separate from cosmology. It was one way in which ancient people brought their understanding of the movements of heaven and earth, cycles of time, and patterns of change into practical judgment. This distinction is very important for the study of divination. If we approach the I Ching only through later philosophical interpretations, we may encounter teachings about life, the cultivation of the noble person, yin and yang, change, and the relationship between heaven and humanity. All of these are valuable. But to enter I Ching divination, we must also return to hexagram images, line positions, movement and transformation, numbers, directions, time, and practical judgment. Let us look at one example. The top 9 line of hexagram 9, Xiaoxu, small accumulation. Rain has come, rest has come, virtue is accumulated, the wife's constancy is in danger, the moon is almost full, the noble one's expedition is ominous. Within the single line text, we move from rain to a woman to the moon and then to a noble person setting out. If we read it as a modern philosophical essay, the content may seem disconnected. But if we understand it as a compressed record of accumulated divinatory experience and symbolic judgment, the shifts become much easier to understand. Different phrases may preserve judgments drawn from different kinds of questions. In a question about marriage, the image of the woman may become relevant. In a question about travel or action, the noble person setting out may become the central point. When asking how far a situation has developed, rain and a nearly full moon may provide images of timing, stage, and condition. This way of thinking is also similar to the method we advocate today, learning interpretation through real divination cases. We do not simply memorize isolated rules. We examine the background of the question, the structure of the hexagram, the reasoning process, and the final feedback. Through this process, we observe how the same hexagram, the same line position, or the same image may appear in different real-life situations. The difference is that modern case studies usually preserve a much fuller chain of analysis and reasoning. They allow us to see how a judgment is formed step by step, rather than preserving only a highly compressed final conclusion. For this reason, line text like this should not be interpreted directly as modern judgments about gender. They may preserve judgment language associated with different roles, different situations, and different outcomes. This also shows why the judgments and line texts are important, but reading the words alone may not reveal how the judgment was formed. There is a traditional Chinese expression, 得意忘言. Once the meaning is grasped, the words may be forgotten. Language is a tool, but language is not the final destination. What we are ultimately trying to grasp is the meaning behind the words. And one of the most important ways the Yi gives access to that meaning is through image. Hexagram images, line images, yin and yang, directions, numbers, time, position, movement, and transformation together form an image-number structure. Image is not a decoration added to the text. It is an important foundation for understanding reality and judging change. This is also why this lesson introduces the Yellow River chart, the Luo River writing, the 8 trigrams, the 5 elements, and plum blossom image methods. The judgment and line text preserve recorded judgments. Image number thinking helps us understand the structure behind them. This video is a selected excerpt from the I Ching Divination Foundations course. New complete lessons are released every week, and the course is currently available at the early enrollment price. The price will increase after all 11 lessons have been published. You can find the complete course through the link below.